The Jacksonville humidity hung heavy in the air, a thick, wet blanket that clung to Hope Washington's skin even after she'd left the sterile, air-conditioned chill of the hospital. It was 2 a.m. As a medical assistant, she was used to the graveyard shift, the quiet hum of machines, and the exhaustion that settled deep in her bones. But tonight, the exhaustion was laced with a sharp, biting irritation. Lamont was supposed to pick her up. He'd promised. She'd called him an hour before her shift ended. The call went straight to a crackly, automated voicemail. She tried again as she clocked out. Nothing. Now, her phone was a dead black rectangle in her hand. A cab was out of the question in this part of town at this hour, and the bus had stopped running. That left the 1.5-mile walk home, a walk that required a shortcut through the skeletal remains of a failed industrial park. It was a place of ghosts, where half-finished warehouses stood like concrete tombstones under the sickly orange glow of the streetlights. Hope pulled her worn cardigan tighter around her shoulders, the fabric doing little to ward off the primal fear that pricked at her skin. The rhythmic click of her sensible work shoes on the cracked pavement sounded unnervingly loud in the silence. This was the part of her life she was trying to change, the part where she and Lamont were saving every penny for a down payment on a house in a better neighborhood, a place where a woman didn't have to think twice about walking home alone. Polarizing description. The abandoned park wasn't just empty. It felt predatory. Shadows stretched and writhed in her peripheral vision, morphing from piles of debris into crouching figures. The air, thick with the smell of damp concrete and decay, seemed to vibrate with a low, menacing energy. It was the physical embodiment of a promise broken, a space where safety was a forgotten language. She was halfway through the concrete maze when she heard it, a second set of footsteps, not clicking like hers, but a heavy scuffing sound, a drunk's shuffle. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. She quickened her pace, her breath catching in her throat. Don't run, she told herself. Running invites a chase. The footsteps grew closer, more deliberate. The smell of cheap whiskey and unwashed bodies suddenly overwhelmed the scent of urban decay. A heavy hand clamped down on her shoulder. Hope gasped, spinning around. The man was a silhouette against the distant orange glow, large and imposing. His face was a mess of shadows, but his grin was a flash of yellowed teeth. "What's the hurry, sweet thing?" he rasped, his voice a wet, gravelly sound that made her stomach clench. The next hour was a descent into a hell she never knew existed. He dragged her behind a low concrete wall, out of sight of the deserted street. The world shrank to the scratch of gravel against her back, the crushing weight of his body, and the monstrous things he whispered in her ear. He was an animal, and she was his prey. She fought, but he was too strong. He gagged her with a piece of her own torn uniform, silencing the screams that were tearing her throat apart. He violated her, humiliated her, and broke something deep inside her that she knew would never heal. All she could do was endure, her mind detaching, floating somewhere above the horror, praying for it to end. When it was finally over, he grunted, pulling himself off her. As he fumbled with the button on his jeans, a wave of pure, unadulterated rage washed over Hope, drowning out the pain and the fear. Her trembling fingers brushed against something cold and hard in the dirt beside her, a length of rebar, rusted and heavy. Without thinking, in one fluid, desperate motion, she grasped it. He was turning to leave, a final leering look on his face. She scrambled to her feet, channeling every ounce of her violation, her terror, and her fury into a single, brutal swing. The metal bar connected with his temple with a sickening, wet crack. He dropped without a sound, a puppet whose strings had been cut. Hope stood over him, chest heaving, the rebar still clutched in her hand. The silence was absolute. He wasn't moving. He wasn't breathing. The rage evaporated, replaced by a cold, flooding terror. Sirens wailed in the distance, growing closer. Someone must have heard something. When the police cruisers skidded to a halt, their flashing lights bathing the grotesque scene in strobes of red and blue, Hope dropped the rebar and raised her hands, tears streaming down her face. "He attacked me," she sobbed. "He raped me." The first officer to approach her, a white man with a hard, impassive face, didn't look at her with sympathy. He looked at the dead man on the ground, then at her, a black woman holding a weapon. His eyes narrowed. "Ma'am, I need you to calm down," he said, his tone laced with suspicion. The trial was a blur of systemic injustice. The public defender was overworked and outmatched. The prosecutor, a sharp-suited white man, painted her not as a victim, but as a woman of color with a history of a short temper, twisting a minor workplace dispute from years ago into a pattern of aggression. He argued that she could have run, that she didn't have to use such excessive fatal force. He suggested she lured the man into the park. The jury, comprised of 10 white faces and 2 Hispanic ones, stared at her with a mixture of pity and distrust. They didn't see a violated woman. They saw a stereotype. When the foreman read the verdict, the words echoed in the cavernous courtroom. On the charge of manslaughter, we find the defendant, Hope Washington, guilty. 7 years. 2,105 days. As the bailiff led her away, her eyes found Lamont in the gallery. He was staring at his hands, his shoulders slumped, refusing to meet her gaze. The man whose broken promise had set this entire nightmare in motion couldn't even look at her. And in that moment, a new, colder kind of dread began to settle in her heart. She wasn't just being sent to prison for what she did to a monster. She was being sent there for his failure. And she had a terrifying feeling that the true cost of his betrayal was something she hadn't even begun to understand. The transport van that carried Hope to Lowell Correctional Institution was a metal box of sweat and despair. The Florida sun beat down on the roof, turning the cramped interior into an oven. Hope stared out through the thick, grimy mesh of the window, watching the world she knew, the palm trees, the familiar storefronts, the freedom, recede into a hazy memory. The 7-year sentence felt less like a period of time and more like a tombstone. Lowell was not a place of rehabilitation. It was a human warehouse. The moment she stepped off the van, the air shifted. It was thick with the smell of industrial-grade bleach, stale cigarette smoke, and a low-frequency hum of simmering hostility. The guards, mostly women with stern faces and weary eyes, herded the new arrivals like cattle through a series of clanging gates and sterile corridors. The world was reduced to shades of gray concrete and faded beige uniforms. Hope was stripped, searched, and handed a set of scrubs so worn they were almost white. Every step of the intake process was designed to erase her identity, to sand her down from Hope Washington, medical assistant, wife, and daughter, into inmate, Borvin 8342. Polarizing description. The cell block was a living, breathing organism of noise and tension. The soundscape was a cacophony of echoing shouts, rattling metal doors, and the constant, unnerving murmur of 100 private conversations. It was a place where vulnerability was a scent, and predators could smell it from a mile away. The racial lines were drawn as clearly as the bars on the cells. White inmates clustered in the yard, Latinas controlled the laundry, and the black women held court in the day room. To be without a tribe here was to be prey. Hope was assigned to a cell in C block. Her cellmate was already there, perched on the lower bunk like a queen on her throne. She was a tall, statues-brioned woman named Tanya, though everyone called her Queen T. She had sharp, intelligent eyes that seemed to miss nothing, and a calm, commanding presence that instantly set her apart. She was serving a life sentence for a crime no one dared ask about, and she ran this corner of Lowell with an iron will. Tanya watched Hope enter, her gaze sweeping over her from head to toe, a silent, thorough assessment. Hope felt like a mouse being inspected by a hawk. She placed her meager belongings, a toothbrush, a comb, a Bible, on the empty top bunk, her hands trembling. "New fish," Tanya stated, her voice a low, smoky alto. It wasn't a question. "What did you do to get a ticket to this paradise?" "Manslaughter," Hope whispered, her voice barely audible. 7 years. Tanya let out a low whistle. "Manslaughter? That's a hell of a thing for a woman who looks like she wouldn't swat a fly." "Self-defense?" Hope flinched. "They called it excessive force." Tanya nodded slowly, a flicker of understanding in her eyes. "The system. It chews up people like you and spits them out, especially people who look like us." She patted the space on the bunk next to her. "Sit down, little bird. You look like you're about to fall over." Hesitantly, Hope sat. The thin mattress smelled of disinfectant and faint, old sorrows. "Listen to me," Tanya said, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial hush. "This place has rules, not the guards' rules, the real rules. Rule number 1, you don't show weakness. Ever. You don't cry where anyone can see you. You don't let them see you shake. Weakness is blood in the water, and the sharks are always circling." Hope swallowed hard, nodding. "Rule number 2, Tanya continued, her eyes fixed on Hope's. You pick your people. You don't talk to the guards unless you have to. You don't owe favors to nobody you don't trust. And you don't trust nobody you don't know. Right now, I'm the only one you know." "Why?" Hope asked, the word escaping before she could stop it. "Why are you helping me?" A flicker of something, weariness, maybe even old pain, crossed Tanya's face before it was gone. "Because I know what it's like to be thrown in here when you should have been given a medal. I see the same fire in your eyes I had in mine a long time ago, before it turned to ice." She stood up, stretching like a panther. "You're with me now. You walk with me, you eat with me. Anyone gives you trouble, you come to me. You got it?" "I got it," Hope said, a tiny spark of gratitude warming the cold fear in her chest. In the days that followed, Tanya was her guide through the labyrinth of prison life. She taught Hope which guards were on the take, which inmates were unstable, and how to trade commissary items for small necessities. She showed her how to use a rolled-up magazine to prop her cell door open just a crack for ventilation, and how to heat water for instant coffee using a battery and a piece of wire. These were the tiny skills of survival that defined existence in Lowell. One evening, as the lights-out buzzer blared, Tanya spoke from the bunk below. "That husband of yours, Lamont, he coming to see you?" "He's supposed to," Hope said, staring at the concrete ceiling. "He's putting money on my books." "That's good," Tanya said, but her tone was flat, devoid of encouragement. "Men, they make a lot of promises when these gates slam shut. It's the ones they keep after a few months that tell you who they really are." Hope felt a familiar knot of anxiety tighten in her stomach. It had been 2 weeks. 2 weeks of silence from the outside world, except for the perfunctory deposit notification. She closed her eyes, trying to picture Lamont's face, but all she could see was the top of his head as he stared at the floor during her sentencing. Tanya's words hung in the dark, oppressive air of the cell. She was right. The real test of Lamont's promises hadn't even begun. And as she lay there, listening to the distant, lonely sound of a woman sobbing in another cell, Hope couldn't shake the terrifying feeling that she was about to fail it. The first visit came 2 weeks after her arrival. When the guard called her name, "Washington, you have a visitor," Hope's heart did a painful lurch. For a fleeting moment, the gray monotony of prison life was pierced by a ray of desperate hope. She smoothed down her beige uniform, ran her fingers through her hair, and tried to compose her face into something other than a mask of exhaustion and fear. She needed to look strong, for him, for herself. The visiting room at Lowell was a long, sterile hall bisected by a thick pane of plexiglass. It was designed to maintain separation, but it felt like it was built to amplify loneliness. Each prisoner and their visitor was allotted a small cubicle with a pair of telephone receivers, creating a flimsy illusion of privacy. The air was thick with a cacophony of hushed, urgent conversations and muffled sobs. Hope saw Lamont through the glass before he saw her. The sight of him was a physical blow. He looked diminished. The sharp, confident man she had married was gone, replaced by a stranger with dark circles under his eyes, a 2-day-old stubble on his chin, and a wrinkled shirt that looked like he'd slept in it. He looked like a man drowning in his own life. She sat down and picked up the receiver, her hand trembling slightly. He finally looked up, and his eyes, when they met hers, were full of a guilt so profound it was almost tangible. "Hope," he breathed into the phone, his voice raspy. "How are you?" The question was so absurd it almost made her laugh. "How am I?" "I'm in prison, Lamont," she said, her voice flat and quiet. "How do you think I am?" Polarizing description. He flinched as if she'd struck him. His entire posture was one of apology. He hunched over the phone, his shoulders caved in, a portrait of a man consumed by remorse. But beneath the surface of his sorrow, there was a jittery, nervous energy. His eyes darted around the room, never staying on hers for more than a second. It wasn't the steady gaze of shared grief. It was the shifty-eyed panic of a man hiding a secret. He was a paradox of guilt and deception. "I know. I'm so sorry, Hope. I'm sorry for everything," he stammered. "If I had just been there, if I had picked you up." "Why weren't you?" she asked, the question she had screamed in her mind 1,000 times. "Where were you, Lamont?" "The car," he said, reciting the words like a well-rehearsed script. "I told you, the battery died. I was stuck on the other side of town trying to get a jump. And my phone was dead. I swear, Hope." It was the same story he'd told the police, the same story he'd told her one frantic, tearful time before the trial. But now, seeing him through the cold, unforgiving clarity of the plexiglass, she felt a profound sense of wrongness. He wouldn't look her in the eye. A husband whose wife had just endured the unspeakable and was now facing 7 years in prison because he wasn't there for her. Wouldn't that husband look her in the eye, his own gaze filled with the agony of his failure? Lamont's gaze was just empty. She decided to change the subject, the confrontation feeling too raw, too exhausting. "How's the house? Are you watering my ferns?" He seized the topic change with a palpable sense of relief. "Yeah, of course. Everything's fine. Your mom, Shiovanda, she's been coming over to help. You know, with cleaning and stuff, making sure I'm eating." This was news. Mom is... Hope raised an eyebrow. Her mother, Shiovanda Pierce, had never been Lamont's biggest fan. She considered him unambitious, not good enough for her daughter. Their relationship was a landscape of polite, frosty tolerance. The idea of her coming over to cook for him was bizarre. "Yeah," Lamont shrugged, trying to sound casual. "She's been a big help. Worried sick about you, of course. We're both worried." The rest of the 30-minute visit crawled by in a haze of awkward small talk. He told her about his job at the auto parts store, about a neighbor's dog that wouldn't stop barking. He asked her about the food, about the routine, safe, superficial questions that built a wall between them far thicker than the plexiglass. He was there, but he was a million miles away. When the guard announced that time was up, Lamont's relief was so obvious it felt like another betrayal. "I'll be back next week," he promised, his voice earnest. "I'll put more money on your books. I love you." The words "I love you" sounded hollow, an echo from a life that no longer existed. He didn't come back the next week, or the week after. A full month passed, a month of deafening silence. When he finally showed up again, his apology was a rushed mumble about overtime and being swamped at work. He looked even more distant, more haunted. "What's going on, Lamont?" Hope asked, cutting through his excuses. "You feel far away. I can feel it even through this glass." "It's just, this is hard, Hope," he said, shaking his head, his eyes fixed on the countertop. "Seeing you in here, 7 years, it's a long time." The bitterness rose in her like bile. "You think it's easy for me? I'm living it, every single minute of every single day." "I know," he said, and for a second he looked up. In his eyes, she saw guilt. Yes, but there was something else there too, something she couldn't quite name. It looked like fear and shame tangled together. The visit ended as awkwardly as the first. He promised to come sooner next time. Hope watched him walk away, his shoulders still hunched, a man carrying a weight she was beginning to suspect had nothing to do with her. Back in her cell, Tanya's words from that first night echoed in her ears. "It's the promises they keep after a few months that tell you who they are." Lamont wasn't just breaking his promises, he was drowning in them. And as Hope lay on her bunk, staring into the darkness, a terrifying question began to form. A question she was almost too afraid to ask. What if the weight he was carrying, the secret that made him so afraid, was worse than a simple broken promise? What if the reason he wasn't there for her that night wasn't because his car broke down, but because he was somewhere he was never supposed to be? The day Shiovanda Pierce came to visit, the air in Lowell seemed to crackle with a strange energy. Hope had been dreading it. Her relationship with her mother had always been a complex dance of duty and distance. Shiovanda was a woman who valued appearances above all else, and Hope's incarceration was the ultimate stain on the family's image. Hope expected to see a woman broken by shame, or perhaps steely with disappointment. The woman who sat down behind the plexiglass was neither. Shiovanda looked incredible. Hope had to blink to make sure she was seeing her correctly. Her mother, who usually favored practical, unassuming clothes, was wearing a stylish, brightly colored blouse. Her hair, normally pulled back in a simple bun, was freshly cut and styled, framing her face in soft waves. She was wearing makeup, not just a touch of lipstick, but foundation, blush, and mascara that made her eyes pop. She looked 10 years younger, vibrant, and inexplicably happy. Polarizing description. Giovanna was a flower blooming in a graveyard. In the drab, colorless world of the prison visiting room, her radiance was almost offensive. She glowed with a vitality that felt like a personal affront to Hope's suffering. It wasn't the look of a grieving mother, it was the look of a woman in the throes of a new love affair. The contrast between her own reflection in the glass, pale, gaunt, clad in a faded beige uniform, and her mother's dazzling appearance was a chasm of unspoken cruelty. "Hi, honey," Giovanna said, her voice bright as she picked up the receiver. "You're looking... okay." "You look amazing, Mom," Hope replied, her voice flat. The compliment was an accusation. "Life seems to be treating you well." Giovanna preened, a small, self-satisfied smile playing on her lips. "Well, life goes on. I figured a little self-care wouldn't hurt. No use in all of us falling apart, is there?" The casual cruelty of the statement stole Hope's breath. "I'm glad you found the time to come," Hope said, steering the conversation. "Lamont said you've been at the house a lot." For the first time, a flicker of something unreadable crossed Giovanna's face, a momentary freeze. Then she shrugged, recovering her composure. "Well, someone has to keep an eye on things, and on that boy. He'd live on takeout and let the place fall to ruin if I didn't step in." "That boy?" Hope repeated. "He's 32, Mom." "You're both just kids to me," Giovanna said dismissively, "and you both made messes. You, with your situation, and him, with his—" She trailed off, catching herself. Hope leaned forward, her knuckles white where she gripped the phone. "His what, Mom? His what?" "Nothing," Giovanna said quickly, waving a dismissive hand. "Just, he's lost without you. Needs someone to look after him. That's all." The entire visit was a masterclass in evasion. Every time Hope tried to talk about Lamont, about the night of the attack, about her feelings of betrayal over his absence, Giovanna expertly redirected the conversation. She talked about work, about a nosy neighbor, about a second cousin who was having surgery. It was a dizzying barrage of meaningless chatter designed to fill the silence and avoid the truth. But the most shocking moment came when Hope, her voice thick with bitterness, said, "I just can't get over it. If Lamont had been there, none of this would have happened. I blame him." "You can't do that," Giovanna said, her tone suddenly sharp and fervent. The casual facade dropped, replaced by a fierce, almost desperate defense. "You can't blame him, Hope. He couldn't have known some psycho was lurking in that park. It's not his fault." Hope stared at her, dumbfounded. This was the same woman who had spent the last 4 years criticizing Lamont for every minor flaw, for being late to dinner, for not mowing the lawn, for buying the wrong brand of coffee. She had never, not once, taken his side against Hope. And now, she was defending his most catastrophic failure with the passion of a trial lawyer. "Everyone has circumstances, Hope," Giovanna insisted, her eyes avoiding Hope's. "You can't hold him responsible for the actions of a monster." The pieces began to click into place in Hope's mind, forming a picture so grotesque, so impossible, that her brain initially refused to accept it. Lamont's nervousness, his flimsy excuses, her mother's sudden, stunning transformation, her unprecedented defense of a son-in-law she'd always despised. It wasn't just one strange thing, it was a pattern, a conspiracy of two. Back in her cell that evening, Hope felt a chilling numbness spread through her. She lay on her bunk, replaying the visit in her mind. Tanya, sensing the shift in her, looked down from the top bunk. "That bad, huh?" "It's not bad," Hope said, her voice a hollow whisper. "It's insane." She told Tanya everything, the new hair, the fancy clothes, the bizarre defense of Lamont. "I feel like I'm going crazy, T, like I'm imagining things." Tanya was silent for a long moment. Then she climbed down and sat on the edge of Hope's bunk. "You're not crazy," she said softly. "You're a woman, and a woman's intuition is the truest thing in this world. When something feels that wrong, It's because it is that wrong. She paused, her gaze steady and serious. I think you know what it is. You're just afraid to say it out loud. Hope stared at her, the monstrous thought finally taking full form, demanding to be acknowledged, her mother and her husband, Shiovanda and Lamont. No, Hope whispered, shaking her head in denial. No, it's impossible. They hate each other. Hate and passion are two sides of the same coin, little bird, Tanya said grimly. And from what you're telling me, it sounds like they flipped it. The words hung in the air, a death sentence for the world Hope had once known. The possibility was no longer just a flicker of suspicion. It was a raging fire, and she was standing right in the middle of it. The weeks that followed Shiovanda's visit were a special kind of torture. The seed of suspicion Tanya had helped plant had taken root and grown into a suffocating vine, choking the life out of every memory Hope had of her husband and mother. She replayed years of conversations, searching for missed signs, for subtle shifts in their dynamic. The impossible was beginning to feel horrifyingly plausible. She needed proof. She needed to be wrong. The proof arrived on a sweltering Thursday afternoon, tucked inside a plain white envelope during mail call. The handwriting was unfamiliar, a neat, slightly shaky cursive. The return address was for a Beatrice Kingsley, a name she vaguely recognized. An elderly woman who lived a few houses down from her mother. They'd never spoken, but they'd exchanged polite waves over the years. Hope's hands trembled as she tore it open. The letter was short, its words chosen with care, but they landed with the force of a battering ram. Dear Hope, we have never formally met, but I have been your mother's neighbor for over 20 years. I heard about your terrible misfortune, and I have wrestled with my conscience for months about whether to write this letter. I can no longer remain silent. I feel you have a right to know the truth. On the night of the incident, the night you were attacked, I saw your husband's car parked in front of your mother's house. I noticed it, specifically because I was taking my dog out for his last walk around 9:30 p.m., as I do every night. The lights in Shiovanda's house went out around 11 p.m. His car was still there when I went to bed. It was still there the next morning, when I went to get my newspaper at 6 a.m. I am so deeply sorry if this news causes you more pain, but I believe that a truth, no matter how painful, is better than a lie. Please take care of yourself. Sincerely, Beatrice Kingsley. Hope read the letter once, twice, a third time. The words blurred through a film of hot, angry tears. The neat cursive seemed to mock her, spelling out the ultimate betrayal in polite, measured sentences. While she was fighting for her life in a dark, abandoned lot, while she was being violated by a monster, her husband, the man who was supposed to be her protector, was in her mother's bed. The car hadn't broken down. The phone wasn't dead. He had simply chosen Shiovanda over her. Polarizing description. The letter was a simple piece of paper, but in Hope's hands it felt like a slab of ice and a hot coal at the same time. The truth it contained was so cold, so clinical, it froze her heart. Yet the rage it ignited burned with a white-hot intensity that threatened to consume her. It was the physical manifestation of her life splitting in two, the life she thought she had, and the ugly, deceitful reality that had been hiding in plain sight. She needed to hear it. She needed one more source, a final nail in the coffin of her old life. The next day she used her weekly phone call, her fingers fumbling with the numbers as she dialed her best friend, April. April had been her rock, the one person besides Lamont who'd been there through the trial. April, it's Hope, she said, her voice tight and strained. Hope! Oh my God, how are you? I was just thinking about you. April's voice was too bright, too cheerful. It was the voice of someone overcompensating. I need to ask you something, April, and I need you to be honest with me, no matter what. There was a pause on the other end of the line. Okay? Have you seen Lamont? Hope asked. Another pause, this one longer, heavier. Yeah, a couple of times, April finally said, her voice dropping. Was he with my mother? Silence. A deep, shuddering sigh came through the receiver. Hope, I don't want to be the one to... Please, April, Hope begged, her voice breaking. I have to know. I already know. I just need to hear it from you. A choked sob. Yes, April whispered, the word barely audible. I saw them, at a cafe on Main Street. They were holding hands. The confession tumbled out in a rush. And Donna from work saw them at the movies, and Marcus said he saw her get into his car last week. Oh, Hope, I'm so sorry. I didn't know how to tell you. You were going through so much, and I didn't want to hurt you more. How long? Hope asked, her voice eerily calm now. The pain was so immense it had become a strange, cold clarity. How long has this been going on? I don't know for sure, April sniffled. People started talking maybe a month or two before the accident. Before the accident. The words hung in the air. This wasn't a new development, a comfort sought in the wake of a tragedy. This was the cause of the tragedy. This was the reason he wasn't there. He wasn't grieving with her mother. He was cheating with her. While Hope was working double shifts to save for their future, he was building a new one with the one person in the world she should have been able to trust implicitly. Hope, are you still there? April's worried voice crackled over the line. The automated voice of the prison operator cut in. Your time has expired. The line went dead. Hope slowly placed the receiver back in its cradle. She stood motionless by the bank of phones, oblivious to the inmates pushing past her. The fluorescent lights of the hallway seemed to hum with a new, menacing frequency. The world had tilted on its axis. She was no longer just a victim of a random act of violence or a flawed justice system. She was the casualty of a calculated, intimate betrayal that was more monstrous than anything that had happened to her in that dark park. Her husband and her mother hadn't just let her down. They had fed her to the wolves. Armed with the devastating truth, Hope felt a strange and terrible calm settle over her. The frantic anxiety was gone, replaced by a cold, hard certainty. When Shiavanda's name appeared on the visitor list the following week, Hope didn't feel dread or sadness. She felt nothing but a glacial resolve. This would be a confrontation, not a conversation. She walked into the visiting room and sat down behind the glass, her posture straight, her gaze unwavering. Shiavanda, once again dressed to the nines, smiled brightly as she picked up the phone. The smile faltered when she saw the look in her daughter's eyes. I know, Hope said, forgoing any greeting. Her voice was as level and sharp as a surgeon's scalpel. Know what, honey? Shiavanda asked, her voice losing its cheerful lilt. I know about you and Lamont, Hope continued, leaning closer to the glass. I know he was at your house the night I was attacked. Beatrice Kingsley wrote to me, and I know you've been seen all over town together for months. April told me everything. Polarizing description. The mask of the vibrant, caring mother didn't just crack, it shattered. Shiavanda's face went through a rapid, ugly transformation. The color drained from her cheeks, leaving behind a pasty gray pallor, then flooded back in a blotchy, guilty red. Her eyes, which moments before had been sparkling, became small and shifty. She was no longer a radiant woman, but a common thief caught in the act, her crime exposed under the harsh fluorescent lights. It's not what you think, she stammered, the words weak and unconvincing. Oh, I think I know exactly what it is, Hope laughed, a bitter, humorless sound. My mother is sleeping with my husband. Did he just accidentally spend the night at your house? Did he accidentally not pick me up because he was too busy with you? You don't understand, Shiavanda said, suddenly shifting from defense to offense, a cornered animal lashing out. You were always so wrapped up in your own world, with your work and your ambitions. He was lonely. He was lonely? Hope's voice dripped with incredulous venom. And you decided to comfort him, my own mother? I'm a human being, Hope, Shiavanda shot back, her voice a strange mix of self-pity and defiance. I have needs. It just happened. Get out, Hope said quietly, the two words carrying more weight than a scream. Hope, listen to me. Get out. This time, she spat the words. Shiavanda flinched, then slammed the phone down in its cradle. She stood up, and for a moment, their eyes locked through the glass. Hope saw no remorse in her mother's face, only the resentful anger of being caught. Then Shiavanda turned and walked away, her defiant posture a final, unspoken insult. Hope returned to her cell in a daze. The cold calm had been replaced by a rage so pure and so vast, it felt like it would split her in two. She told Tanya everything, the words pouring out of her in a torrent of pain and fury. When she finished, Tanya was silent for a long time, her expression grim. She finally patted the bunk next to her. "Sit down," she said. That night, for the first time, Tanya Monroe told her own story. "You know why I'm in here for life, little bird?" she began, her voice low and steady. "I killed my husband." Hope stared at her, the shock momentarily silencing her own rage. "For 10 years he beat me," Tanya said, her eyes looking at a past Hope couldn't see. At first, it was slaps, then punches. Then he started using things, belts, extension cords. For the last 3 years, he invited his friends over to watch. He called it entertainment. Hope felt sick. "I tried to leave twice," Tanya continued, her voice devoid of emotion. "The first time, he found me and broke my arm. The second time, he broke 3 of my ribs and promised that if I ever tried again, he'd go after my little sister. So I stayed. One night, he came home drunk, meaner than usual. After he was done with me, he passed out on the bed. I went to the kitchen, I looked at the knife block on the counter, and I thought about all the years, all the pain. I thought about my sister, and I realized he was never going to stop, not until one of us was dead." She paused, taking a deep breath. "I took the biggest butcher knife. I walked back into the bedroom, and I slit his throat from ear to ear. I sat there and watched the life drain out of him. And you know what I felt? Peace. For the first time in a decade, I felt absolute, total peace." She finally looked at Hope, her dark eyes boring into hers. "They gave me life without parole, said it was premeditated, cold-blooded, but I don't regret it, not for 1 second. He deserved it." Tanya reached out and put a hand on Hope's trembling arm. Her touch was firm, grounding. "I'm telling you this because I see the same thing in your eyes now that I saw in the mirror that night. The moment you realize that some betrayals, some sins, are beyond forgiveness. The moment you understand that a part of you has already been murdered." She leaned in closer, her voice dropping to a whisper, a vow. "They killed a part of you, Hope, your husband and your mother. They murdered the woman you were. Now you have the right to decide what happens to the rest." In the suffocating darkness of the prison cell, Tanya's words were not a temptation. They were a permission slip, a key unlocking a door in Hope's soul she never knew existed. A door that led to a place where justice wasn't something you waited for, but something you took with your own 2 hands. The woman who woke up the next morning was not Hope Washington. That woman had died in the visiting room, her murder finalized by Tanya's story. The person who now inhabited her body was someone new, someone forged in the crucible of betrayal and rage. She was a creature of singular purpose. The grief was gone. The hurt was gone. All that remained was a cold, clear mission. Her transformation was not loud or dramatic. It was silent and methodical. She moved through the prison routine like a phantom, her face an unreadable mask. She did her work in the laundry, ate her meals, and spoke when spoken to, but her mind was elsewhere, meticulously constructing a plan. The first step was acquiring a tool. Lowell, like any prison, had its own shadow economy. Weapons were available, but they cost commissary, favors, or worse. Hope would owe no one. She would make her own. Her chance came during her work detail. For 2 weeks, she'd been transferred from laundry to the metal shop, a chaotic, noisy space where inmates repaired broken furniture and equipment. Under the lazy, indifferent watch of the guards, small scraps of metal were everywhere. One afternoon, while sweeping near a grinding machine, she saw it. A 6-inch piece of flat, discarded steel, about the width of her thumb. It was nothing, a piece of trash. But to Hope, it was everything. With a practiced casual movement, she swept it into her dustpan, and later, in the restroom, slipped it into the waistband of her uniform. Polarizing description. The piece of metal felt cold and heavy against her skin, a secret weight of purpose. Back in the cell, she showed it to Tanya, who examined it with the critical eye of a seasoned expert. The shiv in the making wasn't just a weapon. It was a physical manifestation of Hope's resolve. Every night, the act of sharpening it would be a ritual, a prayer to a new vengeful god. The slow, abrasive process of turning dull metal into a razor-sharp point mirrored the hardening of her own soul. "Good," Tanya nodded, handing it back. "Solid. Now the work begins." The cell floor, under the far corner of Hope's bunk, was rough, unfinished concrete. This became her whetstone. Every night, after the final count and the lights-out buzzer, the ritual would begin. While the rest of Lowell slept or whispered in the dark, Hope would retrieve the steel from its hiding place, a hollowed-out section in the spine of her Bible, and begin to grind. The sound was a soft, rhythmic shh, 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 a sound she masked by coughing or turning in her bunk whenever a guard passed on their rounds. Hour after hour, night after night, she worked. Her fingers grew calloused, sometimes bleeding when she slipped. But she never stopped. The work focused her. It was meditative. With every pass of the steel against the concrete, she channeled her rage. Shh. That was for Lamont's lies. Shh. For Shiovanda's smile. Shh. For the car that never came. Shh. For the years stolen from her. Shh. For the hands on her in the dark. Tanya was her silent partner, her lookout. She would sit on her bunk, a sentinel in the darkness, ready to give a quiet signal if a guard lingered too long. She gave advice in hushed whispers. Angle it more. You want a needlepoint, not a wedge. It's for piercing, not slashing. Wrap the handle later with a strip from your shirt. For grip. Weeks turned into a month. The piece of junk metal slowly, painstakingly, transformed. It developed a wicked gleaming point and an edge so sharp she could shave a sliver of paper from her Bible with it. She tore a strip from the hem of her undershirt and wrapped the handle tightly, creating a crude but effective grip. It was finished. She held it in her hand, the metal cool and solid. It felt like an extension of her own will. "You're ready," Tanya whispered from the bunk below, her voice filled with a somber pride. Hope's final conversation with Lamont, before the one she was now planning, was a masterpiece of cold fury. He'd come to visit, looking more haggard than ever. He confessed everything, his words tumbling out in a pathetic, self-pitying rush. He and Shiovanda were in love, he said. They were planning a future. He wanted a divorce. "I'm sorry, Hope," he'd whimpered. "I never wanted to hurt you." "Good," Hope had replied, a terrible thin smile on her face. "File the papers. I don't care." It was a lie. She cared so much it had hollowed her out and filled her back up with ice. That conversation was the final confirmation. He wasn't just a cheater. He was a colonizer, taking over her life, her mother, her future, all while she rotted in a cage for his sins. Now, with the finished shiv hidden in her Bible, she knew the next step. She would request one more visit, not with her mother, with her husband. She would tell the prison authorities it was to sign the divorce papers he'd so eagerly mentioned. It was the perfect excuse, a natural, final meeting. "He'll come," Tanya said, her voice a low murmur in the dark. Men like him, they need closure. They need to feel like they're the good guy, even when they're the villain. He'll want to see you one last time to get his forgiveness. Hope ran her thumb lightly over the wrapped handle of the shiv. Forgiveness. That was funny. She had something for him, but it wasn't forgiveness. It was justice. Cold, sharp, and final. The request for a divorce consultation was approved without a second glance. It was a common enough reason for a final visit. As Hope walked to the visiting room, escorted by a bored-looking guard, she felt a preternatural calm. There was no fear, no hesitation. Her heart beat with a slow, steady rhythm, like a drum marking the cadence of an execution. The shiv was tucked securely in a hiding place Tanya had helped her devise. Not in her waistband or bra, places they might pat down. It was slipped into the thick sole of her prison-issue sneaker, in a slit she'd carefully carved out and resealed. It pressed against the bottom of her foot with every step, a cold reminder of her purpose. When she entered the long hall, Lamont was already there, sitting in the small cubicle. He looked relieved, as if he'd been granted a parole of his own. He was dressed better this time, a collared shirt, his hair combed. He was trying to look respectable for the final act of their marriage. The sight of him, so composed, so ready to move on, solidified the last molecule of ice in her veins. She sat down and picked up the receiver. Her hand was perfectly steady. "Hi, Hope," he said, offering a small, sad smile. "Thanks for agreeing to this." "Of course," she replied, her voice smooth and even. She let her own smile surface, a faint, placid curve of her lips. We need to handle the paperwork. Be adults about it. Polarizing description. Lamont visibly relaxed. He saw a woman who had accepted her fate, a wife who was resigned and reasonable. He didn't see the predator staring back at him through the glass. Hope's calmness was her camouflage. It was a terrifyingly serene mask hiding a maelstrom of calculated violence. For him, it was a sign of closure. For her, it was the silence before the strike. Yeah, adults, he repeated, grateful. Listen, Hope, about everything. I know sorry doesn't cut it, but I am. I hope one day you can find it in your heart to forgive me. And your mom. My mom, Hope repeated the words, letting them hang in the air. I saw her. She looks happy. She is, Lamont said, a genuine warmth entering his voice. We are. It's strange how it happened, but I think I've found the person I was meant to be with. He looked down, a little bashful. I fell in love with her, Hope. I really did. That was it. That was the final key turning in the lock. I fell in love with her. The casual, selfish, soul-destroying confession. He wasn't just admitting to an affair. He was validating it, sanctifying it, erasing Hope's entire existence in the process. Hope leaned forward, her placid smile still in place. You know, Lamont, she said softly, her voice almost a caress. I think I finally understand. As she spoke, her left hand kept his attention, gesturing vaguely as if she were about to make a point. Simultaneously, her right hand moved down, out of his line of sight. She bent her leg slightly as if adjusting her position on the stool. In one smooth, practiced motion, her fingers slipped into the slit in her shoe and retrieved the shiv. She palmed it, the cloth-wrapped handle fitting perfectly in her grip. What do you understand? He asked, leaning in, eager for his absolution. This, she said. The visiting cubicles at Lowell were not completely sealed. There was a narrow 3-inch gap at the bottom of the plexiglass partition, a pass-through for documents. It was a design flaw, a fatal one. In a movement too fast to process, Hope lunged forward. She wasn't aiming for the document slot. She brought the shiv up in a brutal upward arc, slamming her hand against the plexiglass. Her aim was perfect. The razor-sharp point of the shiv shot through the telephone cord hole, a small circular opening right at neck level. Lamont's eyes went wide with sudden, uncomprehending shock. He made a gurgling sound, a wet, strangled gasp. He hadn't even seen the blade, but he felt it. A hot, searing line of pain across his throat. Hope yanked her hand back, and a spray of arterial blood arced through the hole, painting a brilliant red streak on the plexiglass. Chaos erupted. Lamont clutched at his neck, blood pouring through his fingers. He tried to stand, stumbling backward, his chair clattering to the floor. A woman at the next cubicle screamed, a high, piercing shriek that shattered the dull murmur of the room. Guards were shouting, running. Code Red! Code Red and visitation! Hope didn't move. She remained seated, her expression serene, watching the life drain from her husband's eyes as he collapsed. The shiv was still in her hand, dripping. She had a brief, fleeting moment of clarity. She needed to get rid of it. As the first guard burst through the door to the inmate's side, she dropped the shiv, kicking it with her foot. It skittered across the polished floor, sliding under a row of heavy, bolted-down chairs near the wall, disappearing into the shadows. Then they were on her. Hands grabbed her, slamming her face down onto the table, wrenching her arms behind her back. The cold steel of handcuffs bit into her wrists. She didn't fight. She didn't say a word. As they dragged her out of the room, she caught one last glimpse of the scene. Lamont, a crumpled heap on the floor, in a rapidly spreading pool of his own blood. Paramedics rushing in. And on the plexiglass, a single perfect handprint, etched in her husband's blood, right next to the streak of red. It was her signature on a piece of work she had finally, irrevocably completed. The lockdown was instantaneous and absolute. Alarms blared through Lowell Correctional Institution. A piercing, relentless scream. Every inmate was ordered to the floor, then systematically cuffed and escorted back to their cells. The prison, a simmering pot of tension on its best day, was now a fortress sealed against itself. Detective David Miller of the Marion County Sheriff's Office arrived on the scene less than 30 minutes after the call. Miller was a veteran, a man with tired eyes and a bloodhound's tenacity. He'd seen a lot of things in his 25 years on the job, but a murder in the middle of a packed prison visiting room was a new level of brazen. The scene was a controlled chaos of forensics teams and shaken prison officials. The victim, Lamont Washington, had been pronounced dead on arrival at the hospital. The suspect, his own wife, inmate Hope Washington, was already in the solitary confinement unit, the SHU, as the inmates called it. She wasn't talking. "She denies everything," the warden told Miller, his face pale. "Says she doesn't know what happened, that he just started screaming and collapsed, but a dozen inmates and 3 guards saw her lunge." "We have witnesses, but we don't have a weapon," Miller said, his gaze sweeping the now empty visiting room. The blood was the only thing that remained of the incident, a stark abstract painting on the floor and the glass. "My team's been over every inch of her. Nothing. We've searched the path back to her cell. Nothing." Without the weapon, her lawyer could argue she just punched the glass in a fit of rage and a shard hit him in a freak accident. It's a long shot, but it introduces doubt. The search of the visiting room had been meticulous and fruitless. Guards had turned over every chair, checked under every table, scoured every corner. The shiv, kicked into the shadows by Hope, remained hidden, nestled deep within the complex undercarriage of a row of bolted-down seating. He had a polarizing description. For the prison administration, the missing weapon was a catastrophic failure of security, a symbol of their loss of control. For Detective Miller, it was a challenge, a puzzle that needed to be solved. And for Hope, locked in the silent concrete box of solitary, the missing weapon was a sliver of impossible hope, a fragile shield against a life sentence. The small, hidden piece of metal held the power to define her future. A few more years for assault, or the rest of her life for premeditated murder. Hours turned into a frustrating day. Miller reviewed the security footage. The camera angle was poor, partially obstructed. It showed Hope lunge. It showed Lamont fall. But the critical moment of the strike was obscured by her own body. It wasn't the smoking gun he needed. "This is getting us nowhere," Miller said to his partner, rubbing his tired eyes. "She's a smart woman. She didn't just swallow it. She ditched it somewhere between here and the door. Somewhere we're not looking." He paused, an idea forming. "Get K9 on the phone. Tell them I want their best." 2 hours later, a new player arrived on the scene. A German shepherd named Rocco, a K9 specialist trained in human remains and blood detection. His handler, a young focus deputy, led him into the visiting room. The air was still thick with the smell of bleach and blood. Rocco didn't care about the chaos. He was pure focus. "Seek," the handler commanded, and the dog went to work. His nose was a precision instrument, twitching, sampling the air. He ignored the large, obvious pool of blood where Lamont had fallen. That was old news. He was searching for something else, a trail. He methodically swept the room in a grid pattern, his tail low, his body tense with concentration. He followed an almost invisible trail of microscopic blood spatter from the cubicle to the center of the room. He sniffed at the spot where Hope had been tackled, then cast his head about, searching for the path of the discarded weapon. He moved past the guards and detectives, his senses operating on a level they couldn't comprehend. Finally, he stopped. He stood before the row of heavy, bolted-down chairs where Hope had kicked the shiv. He whined, a low, eager sound, and began to paw at the floor, his nose pressed against the linoleum. Then he sat, looked back at his handler, and let out a single, sharp bark. The signal. A guard came over with a heavy-duty flashlight and a pry bar. He got on his hands and knees, aiming the beam into the dark, complicated space beneath the seats. "I think I see something," he grunted. Using the pry bar for leverage, he reached deep into the shadows. When his hand re-emerged, he was holding a small, crude, and horrifyingly effective weapon, a 6-inch piece of sharpened steel, its handle wrapped in a strip of cloth. The tip was stained dark brown. Detective Miller looked at the shiv lying in an evidence bag. The puzzle was complete. The K9, with its unwavering non-human instinct for the truth, had delivered a justice of its own. It had found the final piece of evidence that would seal Hope Washington's fate. As he walked out of the visiting room, leaving the forensics team to their work, Miller felt a grim satisfaction. The case was closed, but he couldn't shake the feeling that he'd only uncovered the end of a story. and the beginning was something far darker and more tragic than a simple prison murder. The 6 months Hope spent in solitary confinement, the shoe, were like being buried alive. The world was reduced to a 6 by 9 foot concrete box. There were no windows, no books, no human contact beyond a gloved hand pushing a food tray through a slot in the door. The silence was absolute, broken only by the distant screams of other isolated souls or the rhythmic clang of steel doors. She expected to be haunted by Lamont's face, by the memory of the life draining from his eyes. But she wasn't. Her conscience was quiet, her sleep deep and dreamless. The rage had burned itself out, leaving behind a profound and unsettling peace. She had balanced the scales. The price for that balance, she knew, would be the rest of her life. The trial was a formality. With the shiv, the eyewitnesses, and her own chilling calm as evidence, the prosecution painted her as a cold-blooded, manipulative killer. Her public defender tried to argue for a crime of passion, a defense rooted in the deep psychological trauma of her husband's and mother's betrayal. But the jury saw only the act itself, the brutal efficiency of the murder. The verdict was a foregone conclusion. 18 years were added to her sentence. Her new release date was a phantom, a date so far in the future it had no meaning. One day, a guard informed her she had a visitor. She knew who it would be. When she saw Shyavanda through the reinforced glass of the maximum security visiting booth, she barely recognized her. The vibrant, glowing woman was gone, replaced by a ghost. Her mother had aged a decade in 6 months. Her skin was sallow, her eyes were sunken and swollen from crying, and her stylish clothes hung on a frame that had lost too much weight. Polarizing description. Shyavanda was the picture of a grieving woman, a mother who had lost everything. Her pain was raw and palpable. Yet, seeing her, Hope felt no pity. She saw not a victim, but the architect of this entire catastrophe. Shyavanda's sorrow was the price of her own selfish choices, a debt finally come due. Her brokenness was a mirror reflecting the devastation she herself had caused. "Why?" was the only word Shyavanda could manage, her voice a ragged whisper into the receiver. "You really have to ask," Hope replied, her own voice calm and even. "He loved me," Shyavanda sobbed, tears streaming down her hollowed-out cheeks. "And I loved him. You took that from me. You took him from me." "And I love both of you," Hope said, a small, mirthless smile touching her lips. "But you chose each other. You stood on my life to build your little love nest. Did you think it would hold?" "You've ruined my life," Shyavanda whispered, her grief curdling into anger. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" "It's funny," Hope said, leaning forward. "That's exactly what I thought when I found out about you two. When I realized that if he hadn't been in your bed, he would have been there to pick me up. I wouldn't have been in that park. I wouldn't have been raped. I wouldn't have killed that man. I wouldn't be in here." She held her mother's gaze. "You didn't stab me, Mom. You just handed me over to the men who did. You killed me first, just slower." Shyavanda recoiled as if struck. "You're a monster." "Maybe," Hope shrugged. "You helped create me." "I'm never coming back," Shyavanda said, her voice shaking. "You are not my daughter, not anymore." "You were never my mother," Hope replied softly. "Goodbye, Shyavanda." Her mother slammed the phone down and fled. Hope watched her go, feeling nothing. A chapter had closed. When her time in the shoe was finally over, she was transferred back to the general population, but to a different, higher security block. As she was escorted down the familiar corridor, she wondered where she would end up. The guard stopped in front of a cell. C block, her old block. He unlocked the door and gestured for her to enter. Her eyes adjusted to the dim light. A figure was sitting on the lower bunk, reading a tattered paperback. The figure looked up. It was Tanya. Tanya, Queen T. Monroe had pulled every string she had, called in every favor she was owed over a decade, to get Hope transferred back to her cell. It was an almost impossible feat, a testament to her influence within the prison's complex social hierarchy. Without a word, Tanya stood up. She closed the distance between them and wrapped her arms around Hope. It wasn't a quick, friendly hug. It was a fierce, grounding embrace that lasted for a long, silent moment. It was an anchor in a storm, a confirmation of a bond forged in the deepest fires of hell. Hope, who hadn't been touched with kindness in over 6 months, felt the rigid wall around her heart crack. She buried her face in Tanya's shoulder and held on, a silent sob of relief shaking her body. "Welcome home, little bird," Tanya whispered, her voice rough with emotion. "It's good to be back," Hope managed to say, the tension of the last year finally beginning to dissolve. In this cramped concrete cell, in the arms of this convicted killer, Hope Washington, for the first time since that fateful night, felt safe. She was home. The years that followed were a study in monotony and survival. Prison time has a strange quality. It crawls and flies all at once. Days bleed into weeks, weeks into months, marked only by the changing seasons visible through the high, barred windows. For Hope and Tanya, life fell into a rhythm. They were an unshakable unit, a two-person tribe in the brutal ecosystem of Lowell. They worked together in the library, ate together, and shared every secret, every fear, and every sliver of hope in the quiet darkness of their cell. Tanya, ever the strategist, had been working on something for years. Her lawyer, a tenacious bulldog of a man, had been fighting a protracted legal battle over her deceased husband's estate. His family was wealthy, powerful, and had fought tooth and nail to ensure the woman who killed their son got nothing. But the law, in its weird and wonderful ways, had nuances. After a decade of appeals and litigation, a judge finally ruled that, despite the murder conviction, Tanya was entitled to a small, legally mandated portion of the marital assets. It wasn't a fortune, but it was enough for a new start. "When I get out," Tanya said one night, her voice a low promise in the dark, "I'm coming back for you. I'll be waiting." Tanya's release day came on a bright, crisp autumn morning. After 15 years, she walked out of the gates of Lowell, a free woman. The world felt impossibly large, loud, and fast. The first thing she did was buy a new set of clothes that weren't beige. The second was to check into a hotel and sleep in a real bed with clean white sheets. With the inheritance money, she bought a used but immaculate black Cadillac, a symbol of a life she was reclaiming. 8 years passed, 8 more years of the same routine for Hope. But now, with a concrete goal, Tanya's promise. On a sun-drenched morning in late April, it was Hope's turn. After 25 years, her debt was paid. She walked through the final clanging gate, clutching a small mesh bag with her meager belongings. She stepped out into the bright Florida sun, squinting. The world felt alien. For a few seconds, she just stood there, a ship without a rudder, lost. And then she saw it. Parked across the street, gleaming in the sun, was a black Cadillac. Leaning against the hood was Tanya. Polarizing description. Tanya looked different, yet exactly the same. The years of freedom had softened the hard lines around her eyes, but the same quiet strength, the same unwavering loyalty radiated from her. She was a beacon of impossible fidelity, a killer who had kept a promise more sacredly than any law-abiding citizen. The sight of her, waiting there after all this time, was a testament to a form of love and justice that the outside world could never comprehend. A slow smile spread across Hope's face. She walked, then half ran, across the asphalt. They met in the middle of the road, and the hug was just like the one in the cell all those years ago, a silent affirmation of everything they had survived. "You came," Hope whispered into her shoulder, her voice thick with emotion. "I promised, didn't I?" Tanya said, pulling back to look at her, her eyes shining. "Ready to start living?" "More than ready," Hope said, glancing back one last time at the grim gray walls of Lowell. She got into the passenger seat, the plush leather a forgotten luxury. Tanya started the car, the engine purring to life. "So," she said, pulling onto the highway, "where to? We've got money, we've got a car, and the whole world in front of us." "The ocean," Hope said without hesitation. "I want to see the ocean. I've almost forgotten what it looks like." "The ocean it is," Tanya grinned. They drove in comfortable silence for a while, the prison disappearing in the rearview mirror, dissolving into a bad memory. The highway stretched out before them, a ribbon of infinite possibility. "You know," Hope said softly, watching the palm trees blur past her window. "After all of it, I don't regret it. What I did to him." Tanya reached over and squeezed her hand. "Me neither," she said, her voice firm. "Not a single damn thing. The car sped forward, carrying them toward the coast, toward a new life they had earned through pain, resilience, and a loyalty to each other that transcended law and judgment. The story of Hope Washington is a brutal examination of justice. It questions what justice means when the system itself is unjust, when those meant to protect you are the architects of your downfall. It's a testament to the fact that the most profound betrayals don't come from enemies, but from those who are supposed to love us. But more than that, it is a story of survival. It shows that even in the deepest, darkest pits of despair, human connection can be a lifeline. It proves that family is not always the one you are born into, but the one you find in the trenches. Hope's story is a chilling reminder of how far a person can be pushed, but it is also a powerful and ultimately hopeful story about the enduring power of loyalty and the unquenchable human spirit's capacity to find light and a new beginning, even after the longest, darkest night.